In Fairfax County, Virginia, police find a decomposed body, but have no report of a crime. In Fort Myers, Florida, a killer confesses to a grisly crime, but the police cannot find a body. A serial killer may go free unless police find the evidence to put him behind bars. In each case, forensic scientists must find proof of the crime in the bones of the murder victim. Using scientific studies of human decay to find out when the victim died so the killer may be traced. Hoping to prove there is no perfect crime. That dead men do talk. December 1993. In a wooded area near Washington, D.C., a surveyor has made a gruesome discovery. While mapping out a new suburb in the Virginia countryside, he has stumbled on a body buried in a shallow grave. Officers from the Fairfax County Police Department arrive at the secluded area where the body had been found. The first homicide detective on the scene is Detective Jerry Farrell.
How you doing, Officer Gregory? What do you got?
There's a human skull right over here.
Okay. Let's take a look.
The police assume it's a homicide. But there are no immediate clues to help identify the victim.
And Lieutenant Wilson, he's there. You want to take a look? What you're going to need is start mapping out the area. Secure this area here, and then we're going to need at least 50-foot area perimeter set up around this one.
The team of investigators will search a wide area. Scavengers have dragged parts of the body away. The police meticulously document the position of the body with photographs, sketches, and notes. Detective Dennis Wilson heads the cold case squad, investigating crimes where the trail of evidence has gone cold. In such cases, every clue, every piece of evidence, no matter how small, may be the key to solving the crime.
Involved in the murders of a couple of prostitutes in an adjoining county.
How many core samples do you
From
think
bits
we're
of
going to need?
clothing and hair, Detectives Wilson and Farrell are fairly sure the victim is a woman. Since decomposition often leaves fatty residues, the officers take soil samples near the body. Chemical analysis could help determine when the victim was buried.
Well, you only have one chance at a crime scene, and you have to do it right the first time. So you slow things down at that point. There's no hurry. The body's obviously been there for some time. We're going to try to gather all the evidence we can and make sure we don't miss anything. There just may be one small little clue here that's going to lead to either her identity or the identity of the perpetrator.
Because the body is so badly decomposed, the detectives make a call to nearby Washington, D.C. Dr. Douglas Owsley of the Smithsonian Institution is an anthropologist whose specialty is identifying human remains, from soldiers who died in the Civil War to the modern-day victims of homicide. He has testified in many criminal trials as a forensic scientist. Forensic meaning science used as proof in a court of law. Receiving the call from the Fairfax County Police, he agrees to visit the site where the skeleton has been found. In the usual case, murder victims are assigned to medical examiners who dissect the body to find the cause of death. But medical examiners are accustomed to dealing with fresh bodies. Here, only bones are left to tell the tale, requiring the special skills of the anthropologist. It takes 3 days of careful excavation to take the body from the ground. Back in his laboratory, Owsley hunts for signs of the victim's age, sex, and the manner of death.
One of the things that we focus on is
It is immediately apparent that the victim is female. The pelvic bone is wider in females to accommodate childbirth. Though Owsley believes the victim was a young adult, it's difficult to be more precise.
She does not show any signs of arthritis, not severe arthritis. If you look at her spinal column, there's only minor changes, no development of arthritis. Her pubic bones are showing a stage of maturity that would be consistent with somebody that is about 30 years of age. And
In a young
one of
person,
features
the
that we
sutures of
look
the
at
skull are
is
plainly visible.
sutures. This is a very general aging indicator, but in a young
As a person grows older, the sutures tend to fuse together.
And so in her cranium,
In the victim's skull, the sutures are starting to disappear, confirming that the victim was a young adult.
in the suture.
Only 5 feet 1 inch tall, she'd been stabbed repeatedly. The knife blade leaving marks on the collarbone, ribs, and vertebrae.
Looking at the pattern of cuts in the bone, you can tell that the individual was behind her at least some of the time. She has knife wounds that penetrated in the back and the midline. The cut that is in the clavicle and the collarbone, there's many different positions that could account for that, but one would be the individual reaching over her.
Attaching a name to the body will not be easy. To shed more light on this mysterious case, police must determine the identity of the victim. In Fort Myers, Florida, police will have the opposite problem. A crime without a body.
911, what is your emergency?
Yeah.
Okay, one moment, sir. Betty, I have a man on the phone advised he just murdered someone.
In a police communication center in Fort Myers, Florida, a 911 call will lead to the discovery of a grisly crime dating to 1989.
911, what is your emergency?
I'd like to report a homicide on Piney Road.
Murder, where did it happen?
I'm only calling in because I should confess to what I did.
And you did it?
Yeah.
Okay.
The caller reports a murder he has recently committed.
Why did you do that?
I don't know. I'm normal everything.
He says he's thought of turning himself in, but hasn't decided
Why
yet.
turn yourself in?
I'm thinking about it.
All right, are you going to wait there for us?
The 911 call is traced to a shopping center phone booth. The operator tries to keep the killer on the line, while a message goes out to police units in the area.
Lake County 2, 11-1, 1065, a possible signal 5 at Coral Gate Shopping Center. Orange Grove and Pondella. Orange Grove and Pondella.
Officer Paul Rose monitors the call and finds no one at the shopping center phone booth where the call originated. But less than a mile from the shopping center, he has spotted a possible suspect. The suspect had been walking hurriedly at the side of the road, away from the direction of the shopping center. The suspect, whose name is Paul Klein, quickly admits he made the 911 call confessing murder. He is advised of his rights and taken into custody. The previous night, he'd broken into a house and strangled an elderly woman on the couch where she lay. There is no sign of anything missing. Robbery had not been the motive. Lieutenant Jeff Taylor, entering the house, found the victim just as Klein had described her. But he would soon find out that she had not been Klein's first victim.
Klein related to me that he heard voices, and the voices made him to become angry. And every time he became angry, he had to kill someone. And when he said that, it indicated to me that perhaps there were other victims also. And I asked him at that time if he had killed before, and he said yes, twice.
Klein had murdered one other woman in a trailer some months before. But his first victim had been a friend named Danny Webster, killed a year and a half earlier in August 1989. Luring Webster into a field to look for aluminum cans, Klein had beaten him to death with a lead pipe. A crime scene search unit scours the area where the killing allegedly occurred.
There you go, I got something over here.
Oh yeah? What is it?
Work boot.
Does it look like it's been there a while, or?
We had information that we believed at the time that the crime was committed, the original act of the homicide was committed in this field. So what we did a grid search of this whole field, and upon doing that, we located a shoe. It's early to tell right now if it actually belongs to the victim, but we believe there's a good possibility that it does. Therefore, once we found the shoe, we have to treat it as evidence.
According to Klein's confession, he had returned to the scene of the crime 3 days after the murder. Arriving at night to avoid detection, he swam with the body to a marshy swamp island, where he dismembered the corpse with an axe and a paring knife. After disposing of Webster's body so thoroughly and getting away with his crime for a year and a half, Klein has now decided to confess. The crime scene search officers find a small piece of bone, photographed exactly where it is found. But they will not find a body. Without a body, police do not have enough evidence to convict. Detective Jack Schell interrogated Klein under tight security. Klein had once bent a stop sign with his bare hands.
We needed a positive identification of the body. Although we had somebody telling us who they killed and that they killed them, we still have to prove who was killed, how they were killed, and when they were killed, to the best we can. It's the corpus delicti, the body of the crime. We have to be able to establish that, yes, this person died and that this person did it.
I guess I must have actually hit him about, I don't know, maybe more than 200 times. I'm not sure. I just kept whacking at everything. I hit him in the legs, the arms, everywhere I could get his face. Just his head region was more where I actually hit more than anything. But that was after he was already dead too. You know, I just kept hitting.
Klein's confession by itself is not enough to prove the case beyond a reasonable doubt. The police must find the body. Klein pointed out the marshy island where he says he left the dismembered corpse. But even if police can find it, it will be hard to identify after a year and a half in the swamp.
The taller bush.
The case will go to Dr. William Maples of the University of Florida, a world-renowned authority on the identification of skeletal remains. In 1991, he led the team that exhumed the bones of President Zachary Taylor, who died mysteriously in 1850. Some historians say Taylor was poisoned, making him, not Abraham Lincoln, the first American president to be assassinated. After testing the dead president's hair and fingernails for poison, Dr. Maples laid the body and the assassin theories to rest. In the case of Paul Klein, it is immediately clear to Maples he is dealing with a possible psychopath totally unaffected by death.
Well, bodies in Florida tend to bloat very rapidly. Florida is known for its sunshine and good weather, especially in the area of Fort Myers where this took place. So the first thing that our killer attempted to use was a paring knife. It is very flexible, it is light, it may be sharp, it may be serrated, and may be very, very effective sometimes in cutting up bones. The so-called Ginsu steak knife is amazingly flexible and yet will go right through bone if it's properly used. So our killer sticks the knife into this bloated body and outpours all over him yellow and green discharge, foul-smelling fluid. This is enough to really disturb anyone, even if they weren't disturbed to start with.
But the killer's use of a paring knife may be the key to identifying the victim's remains and corroborating Klein's confession.
If we take a paring knife and rub along a stick or a bone, or whatever the case might be, you notice that the blade jumps and chatters. This chatter produces an interrupted type of cutting on the bone surface. And we look for this evidence of chattering, and that tells us how flexible or inflexible the blade is. On the other hand, if we take a good heavy-bladed sharp knife and cut on the bone, it doesn't chatter, it simply shaves the bone. And this is evidence of a heavier, less flexible blade.
Crime scene search officers arrive at the island where Klein left the dismembered body. If they can find bones that were sliced with a paring knife, they'll have strong proof that Klein's confession is real.
Hey, Chris. How you doing? We're gonna earn this one. We're gonna earn this one.
Klein was to have accompanied the officers himself, but in the boat going over to the island, he'd been much too excited at the prospect of seeing his victim's remains. For their own safety, the officers decided to search without Klein's assistance. It's a serious mission, for unlike his other crimes, the murder of Danny Webster was vicious enough to send Klein to Florida's electric chair, or else prove beyond all doubt he's a dangerous psychopath to be put away indefinitely.
He seemed like a normal person. You didn't notice any psychological problems or anything, but the more it went on and the more I realized he was telling me the truth and that these gory facts he was telling me really did happen, then I'm beginning to think, you know, we got a real weirdo here that can do this and talk about it so calmly and so intelligently.
Klein had a nickname he didn't like. Because his arms extended out from his body as he walked, kids made fun of him, calling him Popeye.
What I did is,
He'd killed Danny Webster for calling him names, repeating time after time it was because Webster had harassed him.
How are you feeling?
I'm feeling pretty good. Everything's all right. I just have to go ahead and, I don't know, I think I feel almost a little dizzy for that matter. I have to eat a little bit of something, take my medication.
Is that person in the march, Danny Webster?
Yes, ma'am. Yep, that's him. Or that was him.
Why did you kill him?
He was always being cruel and, I don't know, calling me names and stuff, and I decided to go for it.
Okay?
Watch your head, Dave.
Hey, thank you, ma'am. I appreciate everything.
Watch your head.
The island where Klein left the body is partially submerged and subject to changing tides. The logistics of finding evidence are very difficult. Finally, more bones are found. The body is in pieces, just as Klein had said.
I asked him, how did you take this body apart? I believe his response was just like I always do. I took off the left leg, the left arm, the head, the right arm, the right leg, in a circular motion like that. And he'd used a hatchet, axe. He told me where the axe was, which was in another state. Him and his father had went to their home in another state and left it there before he came back.
Pieces of bone found on the marshy island are sent to the FBI for examination. The FBI confirms that the bones show evidence of hatchet trauma. An axe or hatchet had been used to cut the body apart. But according to his harrowing confession, Klein had reserved special treatment for the victim's head.
Yep, got his head off with a paring knife, and the head, there was more or less like in pieces, and I tossed it right on an embankment about 25, 30 feet from the mangroves, and I stuck it there for like, I had it there for like the longest time, I guess something like 3.5 months.
He told me that he took the head and kept it to come back and visit it. He would visit it every night and talk to it. And after about 2 weeks, it got to the point where it was deteriorated to the extent that he didn't want it anymore, so he discarded it.
Klein had carried the head around with him in a paper sack, often engaging it in conversation. Spotting a police car on one occasion, he panicked and threw the head into a waterway, but he could not remember where. A police dive team searches the area where Klein may have discarded Danny Webster's skull. It is an area of murky waters, frequented by alligators. They find nothing but coconuts. Unless the head is found, it may be impossible to identify the remains as those of Danny Webster. Here, as in suburban Virginia, the police must team up with science to bring a killer to justice. At the Museum of Natural History in Washington, D.C., tourists gaze at the wonders of the natural world. They are unaware that a few feet away, a storage area holds the unnatural work of a vicious killer. Police in Fairfax County, Virginia, have called on forensic scientist Doug Owsley to help identify the victim of a brutal homicide. The body has decomposed. Only a skeleton remains. Owsley has determined that the victim was a female from 27 to 34 years old. She died from repeated stab wounds. But who is she, and where did she come from?
When you're working with police cases and working on problems of human identification, often when the remains come into the laboratory or when you're involved in the recovery, the identification follows very quickly. There's someone that's missing, there are records that can be obtained, dental records or medical records that you can compare against, and you can get that person identified within a very short period of time.
Okay. All right. Well, if we can help, we'll try.
But police in Fairfax County have found no immediate links to a missing person.
What's your phone number?
Owsley will need every piece of evidence he can find to produce a life history of the victim, to be matched, hopefully, with someone who disappeared as many as 6 years before. Personal effects found with the victim are minimal. An inexpensive hair clip, a hair pick. Her blue jeans had rotted away. Her synthetic underwear remained. Lightweight sandals indicate that the crime was committed in warm weather.
Her hair was a light brown color, as determined from analysis of hair found at the site. We know that her fingernails were painted from fingernails that were recovered at the site. It was a dark glossy pink in color. So there's a lot of details.
On the earrings found near the body is a fragment of human tissue. The metal of the earring had protected it from bacterial decay. The earrings are included in sketches distributed nationwide. Slowly, painfully, the haunting details of the victim's life are coming into focus. In the spinal column are signs of trauma. Depressions in the vertebra are evidence that the discs between the vertebrae have herniated. The victim may have held a job that required heavy lifting. She'd once taken care of her teeth, but in the last years of her life had allowed them to decay. She had fillings on the front teeth to maintain her appearance, but 5 of her molars are missing. Black stains on the teeth are evidence the victim was probably a smoker.
Overall, the impression that you would have, but it's an impression based not only on the dentition, but perhaps some of the things found with it. It would suggest that it was an individual that did not have a lot of money, that fairly limited financial resources.
The information gleaned by Owsley is passed on to the Fairfax County Police Department, where Detective Bruce Guth heads the homicide branch.
In our jurisdiction, many of the murders are committed by people who know the victim.
In the normal case, once the victim is known, the police will talk to neighbors and relatives about the victim's lifestyle, who her friends were, and her enemies. A chain of evidence often will lead to the guilty party.
In this case, we don't know the identity, so it makes it difficult to really go much further till we know who it is.
Detail by detail, Fairfax County Police re-examine the evidence found at the scene. A sketch of what the victim may have looked like is distributed to police across the country, along with other details of the case.
Even though this case is 2 years old, I'm still actively pursuing leads that have occurred. I receive inquiries approximately 2 to 3 a month. Just recently, I received one from Philadelphia, New York City, and Ohio.
Despite the continuing efforts of the Fairfax County Police, there is no matchup of the murder victim with a missing person. To facilitate the search for the victim's identity, Doug Owsley provides data for a second composite sketch using an FBI computer program.
When you look at a skull and you're trying to assess what this individual looked like, the basic form is going to be defined by the skull itself. In relation to that, then you take into consideration the clothing that's found, for instance, because the clothing helps you gain an idea as to the size, the weight of the individual, for instance.
Starting with an image of the skull, the computer adds successive layers of detail. Markers indicate the probable thickness of facial tissue. The measurements are based on population studies of similar age and gender. Hair found at the scene, along with the plastic hair clip and hair pick, suggest a possible hairstyle. The victim had an overbite, a gap in her front teeth, and a cosmetic filling. Since these features would have been visible in life, the victim is shown smiling in the final illustration. But despite the pains taken to create a lifelike image, there is still no response when the image is published nationwide. Part of the problem, the police are still unsure when the murder occurred. When discovered in 1993, the bones had been dry. The flesh had long since rotted away.
You'd have to say that it would be at least a year and a half before that this could have happened. But in reality, I think it could extend back further in time. And so if we take the maximum range, one of the things found in a pocket was a quarter that dates to 1980. So looking at the time frame, we're in terms of the extremes, probably talking between 1991 and 1980.
The problem of dating murder victims found long after the crime has occurred may soon have an answer. At a body farm in Tennessee, an unusual study is underway, using the volunteered flesh and bones of the dead. In Fairfax County, Virginia, police continue their search for clues to identify a woman found in the Washington suburbs. In Fort Myers, Florida, a confessed serial killer has led police to a headless body, barely identifiable as human. In both cases, work done at the Tennessee Anthropology Research Facility, or TARF, will prove invaluable. Its director is Dr. William Bass, a forensic anthropologist at the University of Tennessee in Knoxville. His expertise is the human skeleton.
An individual who'd been dead about 10 days found out on the edge of the railroad.
When a person is recently dead, morphological features such as prints on the fingers and palms can help with identification. When these features are gone and only the bones remain, the case is one for forensic anthropology. Bass's facility receives on average one body a week for identification. Parts of Tennessee have become a dumping ground for murder victims.
We don't think of the interstates as being avenues of crime, but they're absolute avenues of crime. So you can kidnap somebody in Chicago. You can come down I-75, which comes down through Cincinnati, through Lexington, Kentucky, into Tennessee. The first real area that you get to on I-75 going toward Florida that is really rural is Tennessee. And we get a lot of bodies thrown out there.
With so many bodies, Bass has invented a boxing system for storage.
Every skeleton gets his own box. So you want to box them because if you don't, they will get lost, they will get dirty.
On the shelves surrounding him are over 2,000 skeletons sent to Bass's facility by medical examiners around the state. With the help of graduate students, Bass assists the police in determining the sex, race, and other identifying characteristics of unclaimed bodies. But in doing his work, Bass became acutely aware there were no reliable statistics on rates of human decay. He established near Knoxville an outdoor preserve known informally as the Body Farm. Here, he has planted not living things, but dead. Human bodies left in the open to decompose. It's an experiment that will tell him how bodily decomposition is affected by weather, climate, and the degree of exposure to the elements.
This is a body that we're studying the effects of the covering of the body that the maggots leave.
This body has been outside for a year. Maggots have eaten its inside away, but left some of the skin for protection.
Maggots don't like sunlight, and what they do is they leave this as an umbrella to protect themselves from the sun. And so you get bodies like this that will have the covering on them holding the bones together, although there are no internal organs left there at all.
The specimens used for Bass's experiments come from two basic sources: those who have donated their bodies to science and unclaimed bodies sent to the facility by medical examiners. After the bodies have lain in the open to decompose, they are brought back to the laboratory for analysis. Dissection will tell how their exposure to the elements has affected their skin, bones, and tissue. These statistics will then aid police departments in determining how long a newly discovered homicide victim has been dead. To keep out intruders with morbid curiosities, security guards keep the body farm under tight surveillance. Bass has attempted to duplicate all the common ways in which killers dispose of their victims.
Well, we try to keep as honest a setting as we can. We try not to make anything artificial. It's exactly the way it is in nature. What we have here is an automobile that we have been looking at the decay rates of people in automobiles, both in the passenger compartment and in the trunk.
A body placed in the trunk for observation has since been removed, but its byproducts remain. Tiny pupil cases from which flies have emerged. A matter of minutes after death has occurred, flies are attracted to the body to lay their eggs. The eggs will hatch into larvae, or maggots, that feed on the decaying flesh before turning into flies.
We can tell you that this individual has been in this trunk at least 21 days from the fly pupae that are present, from the pupil cases that are present here.
In the back seat of the car, another body has been removed, again leaving a clue as to time of death.
Hair mass.
What's called the hair mass falls off a dead body after a week's time. Bass has found that in enclosed vehicles, the buildup of heat often accelerates the process of decomposition.
This came in last week, and I kind of want to get an idea of what they look like now.
Some of the bodies have been dead only a week.
Well, he hadn't gone very far. Well, they're both at about the same stage, aren't they? On that body.
Others are much older.
Well, there are some maggots right there, but that maggot is frozen. He's gotten away from the warmth of the body and didn't make it back to the body, so there are a couple right there. I'm going to push this back just a little bit more here, and we'll see if we can't get under there. And I'm not really sure. Well, you see, there are lots of maggots. See, there are hundreds and hundreds of maggots in there, and they are either slowed down. They're not doing much right now because it's so cold.
Each month, Bass sends bone and hair samples to the FBI for analysis. The samples come from a number of different specimens in a variety of locales within the farm. The FBI will study how time, exposure to the elements, and the environment in which a body is found may alter its DNA.
You can do DNA analysis on the maggots, and they will produce the same DNA. If the individual has been on drugs, the maggots will pick up those drugs. You can tell from analysis of the maggot. Also, the volatile fatty acids, which are the goo that you see there, those are what are called the volatile fatty acids that leach out of bodies. Now, we've been able to take this material and analyze that and determine the length of time since death up to about 2 years.
In other parts of the facility, bodies lie in coffins above ground. Drainage tubes allow the testing of fluids and air samples without opening the coffin lid.
This is
Nearby, bodies are
part
buried in coffins 6 feet underground, with a culvert allowing access. Here, Bass and his associates study how subterranean burial affects the rate of decay. Since killers have been known to dismember their victims and scatter them around, another area is set aside for body parts. It is not always an exact science, but Dr. Bass's work, the first of its kind, will help the police with murder victims found long after the crime. In the case of Danny Webster in Florida, police have only part of the body. The killer has done a thorough job of dismembering and scattering the remains. Filling in the grisly details of murder and mutilation will be the job of forensic science. At the Lee County Sheriff's Office in Fort Myers, Florida, Paul Klein has confessed to the murder of Danny Webster. But the killer has carved up the body and disposed of its head. The few bones found on a marshy island are 1.5 years old. It may be impossible to prove beyond a reasonable doubt they are the bones of Danny Webster. Klein had been relentless in attempting to conceal his crime. Before decapitating the body, he had pulled out the teeth, knowing they're often used to identify the victim.
He explained that instead of digging a normal grave-type hole, that he dug a round hole as if to put trash or something in it. He set the victim down in it, buttocks first, and shoved him into the hole by his shoulders. When he didn't go in all the way, he jumped up and down on the body until he was able to get it deep enough into the hole that he thought he had it hidden. Then he pulled weeds and dirt over it and laid on his belly, and his words were, slithered back into the water like a big gator and swam back home.
Is Klein a psychopath, or is he a man who has plotted and planned the perfect crime?
Okay, a perfect crime. Let's think, how about Jimmy Hoffa? How far have we gotten on Jimmy Hoffa solving? We don't even know where he is. How can we solve the crime if we don't know where he is? You see, so somebody's already thought of this and said, you know, if you leave the body, it's a good chance you're going to be caught. Because there's all these hair and fiber section of the FBI and the forensic anthropologists of the world all over. All my colleagues were out there trying to figure this out. But if you don't have a body, how do you know you've got a crime, you see?
Detective Harry executed a search warrant at Klein's apartment. It was soon apparent Klein may have learned the techniques of killing from books.
We found probably every true life murder story that was ever written, like Son of Sam, The Hillside Strangler. It was just book after book after book.
From sparse remains, forensic science must identify the body of Danny Webster. If not, the case may be lost. In order to corroborate Klein's confession and make the case hold up in court, anthropologist William Maples will try to determine the age, sex, and race of the partial skeleton.
This is the shaft of the bone. This is the epiphysis, the end of the bone. And they start from separate origins in a child. And they slowly change shape.
As the epiphyses reach the end of their growth, they become fused to the shafts of bone. On the bones in this case, fusion is not yet complete. Maples is able to put the age of the victim between 17 and 23, the same age as Danny Webster. Determining sex is almost always a matter of studying the pelvic bones, narrower in males than females. The victim in this case was clearly a male. But determining race will be more difficult, especially with the head missing. Dr. Maples uses the femur or thigh bone to distinguish Caucasian and black. In a Caucasian, the femur is bowed enough to allow his knuckle to pass under.
In the case of a black individual, the shaft tends to be much flatter and straighter, and there is no anterior bowing. The amount of curvature in the femur clearly indicated to me that we were dealing with a white male.
Finally, Maples examines the bones for evidence of the chatter marks that a paring knife would leave if used to dismember the body.
Killers, by and large, aren't stupid enough to use paring knives, so we don't have a lot of evidence of that.
But the results are positive. By the end of his examination, Maples has conclusive proof that the bones match the description of Danny Webster. The necessary corroboration of Klein's confession is in place. For Lieutenant Jeff Taylor, the case is closed.
Paul Klein is presently in an institution in Chattahoochee, Florida, for mentally insane.
But in Fairfax County, Virginia, police have a tougher problem. A murder victim remains unidentified. A killer may go undetected, free to kill again. More than 2 years have passed since the discovery of a female body in the Virginia countryside near Washington, D.C. Fairfax County investigators, including detectives Jerry Farrell and Dennis Wilson, have sent out extensive information on the case, including descriptions of the victim, dental charts, and a description of some, but not all, of the wounds discovered by forensic expert Doug Owsley. Persons have been known to confess crimes they did not commit, having learned the details of the crime from public sources. By withholding certain information, the police can be sure when a confession is fabricated or genuine.
All right, this is going to be the cut right here.
Far from having a confession, police in Fairfax County, after 2 years of searching missing person files, still do not know who the victim is.
Even today, we think a lot about her and are hoping that through the facial reproductions that have been done, that someone might be able to recognize her, might be able to contact the police and offer new insights, because this is somebody that we need to get identified, and we certainly need to in order to hopefully prevent this from happening again, find out who did this.
We've sent hundreds of leads out, hundreds of posters. We're going to probably revise this again at least once or twice a year. We try to cover it on the TV stations, the media. We try to get the newspapers interested to run the picture. We run not only the artist renditions, but we also run pictures of the clothing. This is no way a case that's just sitting on a shelf and nothing being done.
With a growing population and more people on the move, many crimes may never be solved. Victims like the one found in Fairfax County, her friends and relatives unaware of her death, may remain unidentified, her killer free to kill again.
I think that homicide investigations are getting a little more difficult. The national trend is more stranger-on-stranger murders, as in past years it was family members, domestic kind of murders. Nationally, there's more stranger murders, and forensics becomes a very important part of the investigation.
Was this the work of a serial killer? Doug Owsley believes not. The body was buried in haste, the killer lacking the tools to dismember it so it would never be found. Serial killers, like Florida's Paul Klein, are far more efficient.
You don't gain necessarily that same sort of sophistication in this case. Certainly it led to a tragic end, but in terms of accomplishing what he set out to do, he was much less prepared. On the other hand, he was able to take someone's life, and he's been able to get away with it all these years, and so there's just some piece that we haven't been able to put together to get on his trail yet.
Despite the obstacles to solving the case, detectives in Fairfax County have not given up.
Somebody sooner or later is going to talk about this. That's one of the premises of a cold case squad, that relationships are changing and
technology's changing, things are becoming more advanced.
I'm optimistic that this case could get solved. We keep working at it, chipping away at it. Eventually, it's gonna unfold.
Oh yeah, I'm optimistic. Believe we're going to do it. Sometimes things just take a little bit longer, that's all.
William Maples, for one, believes that few killers escape detection.
No, of course not. They don't play by our rules. They will take chances, do things that we wouldn't do. They just don't play by the rules. And that's helpful to us because that means that they make a lot of mistakes. And by taking chances, they invariably end up getting caught. Thrill is a big element in that. And thrill means that they're taking chances. And God love them. The more chances they take, the more chances we have of catching them.
In Washington State, 2 people die agonizing deaths. Both are victims of poison-laced Excedrin capsules. The news causes public panic and costs manufacturers tens of millions of dollars. In Virginia, a cardiac care unit experiences an epidemic of unexpected deaths. Is this bad care or bad luck? Or is it something more sinister? And a man tries to murder his wife in an insurance fraud.
Your emergency? I've got a medical emergency. My wife is going into some kind of convulsion. And her mouth is foaming.
Poisoners are among the most elusive killers. Today, forensic detectives are employing an arsenal of techniques to uncover and convict them. Who is winning the war?
How's Miss Thomas doing?
No, she's doing great.
Good. Let me take her chart. I'm going to down and check on her.
It is 9 o'clock on a Saturday night when Dr. Joseph Whittle makes his final rounds. Whittle is co-director of the Coronary Care Unit at General Hospital in Petersburg, Virginia.
Hi, Miss Thomas. I'm Dr. Whittle.
He has been on duty since noon. It is time to go home. Among his patients is Josephine Thomas, a 73-year-old retired teacher. She was admitted with heart problems several hours earlier and now is resting comfortably. At around 11 p.m., Whittle orders an IV.
Miss Thomas? Miss Thomas?
The duty nurse signals a code blue, a patient emergency, and calls in Dr. Whittle. Josephine Thomas is in crisis. It takes Whittle just 15 minutes to return.
Everyone clear? Shocking?
Too late. Josephine Thomas cannot be revived. The death troubles the staff. An epidemic of unexpected deaths has struck the cardiac care unit in the past few weeks. 2 nurses suspect that Josephine Thomas may not have died of natural causes. Their suspicions deepen an hour and a half later, when a package of lidocaine is found to be missing.
Okay, lidocaine 2 gram?
No.
You don't find any 2 gram?
We didn't use a 2 gram.
All right. Well, we should have 1 2 gram lidocaine in.
I don't have one.
Lidocaine is a drug given to stabilize heartbeat. In large concentrations, it can be fatal. Whenever a death seems unusual or suspicious, medical and law enforcement personnel are required to contact the medical examiner's office.
Hi, Dr. Fierro. How are you?
Hello, Jim. How are
Dr.
you?
Marcella Fierro is chief medical examiner for the state of Virginia. In her first year as an assistant medical examiner, she worked on the Petersburg case.
The problem arose when it became apparent that there was, one, an increased number of deaths in the unit as compared to previous months, and secondly, that a significant number of them were occurring in the presence of or were being discovered by Leroy Hargrave.
Evening, ladies.
Leroy Hargrave was a 21-year-old nurse's aide whose reputation around the hospital was decidedly mixed. It was Hargrave who had called the alert on Josephine Thomas. Several other deaths had also occurred during Hargrave's shifts. Was this coincidence, or was something else going on? No one had seen Hargrave do anything wrong. It would take all the resources of forensic science to establish what had happened. Throughout the United States, an autopsy is performed whenever the cause of death is unknown. This unknown male was found dead on a Michigan street.
All right, go ahead and check the status of the hair, looking for any injuries on the head.
How did the individual die? Was it natural death, an accident, a homicide, or suicide? Sometimes the answer is undetermined.
You make it to a hospital?
No, not this guy. He was found dead in an older part of town. I'm wondering about lead poisoning. You think we ought to get a heavy metal screen on him?
I think it'd be a good idea.
Why don't we get some head hair too, since arsenic can accumulate in the hair. If we do find arsenic on the general heavy metal screen, then we can fractionate the hair. Since hair grows about 1 centimeter a month, see if there's any chronicity to the poisoning.
Pathologists gather a variety of samples, including muscle tissue, brain, kidney, urine, and blood.
About 30 cc's will be enough, Paul. All right, let's get a piece of kidney too, Paul.
All right.
Each sample may tell a story about the victim's life and death. Poisoning is a rare occurrence, according to James Valentour, head of the toxicology laboratory for the Commonwealth of Virginia.
Poisoning is not automatically suspected. It depends on the circumstances or lack of other evidence following the investigation. If an autopsy is conducted on a young person in otherwise apparent good health and no cause of death is found, then the suspicion of drug involvement or drug contribution to that death increases, and we proportionally increase our analyses until we rule out all the possibilities that we can.
Today, poison specialists, called toxicologists, employ a bewildering array of sophisticated technologies. Antibodies, protein substances the body produces to combat foreign matter, are used to detect toxins. To test for cocaine and its metabolic products, for example, blood is mixed with antibodies specific to certain parts of the cocaine molecule. A fluorescent label is added to the mixture. If cocaine is present, the pattern of fluorescence changes. To identify poison compounds, they must be broken down into smaller parts called ions. Dr. Valentour and his colleagues use the most powerful techniques available, which include the gas chromatograph and mass spectrometer, which are often used in combination. Chemicals are added to a sample to separate any organic drugs present from the blood matrix. The isolated portion is vaporized and passed along a hydrogen-filled tube. Molecules of different size migrate through the tube at different rates. As molecules emerge from the tube, their concentration is measured. Next, the mass spectrometer shatters the molecule into ions, its chemical building blocks. A complex molecule may generate hundreds of ion fragments. The pattern of ions produced is unique to a particular molecule. To identify the unknown substance, its ion signature is compared to those of tens of thousands of chemicals in the computer's database. In time, techniques like these would reveal not one, but 6 poisonings at Petersburg General Hospital.
Lodge at Poison Center, can I help you?
The world is filled with deadly chemicals. An average home harbors dozens of dangerous substances such as chlorine bleach, drain opener, and aspirin, each capable of causing death. The Blodgett Regional Poison Center in Grand Rapids, Michigan receives thousands of anxious phone calls each year. Many concern overdoses, accidental or intentional. Many more involve children who have eaten some bright berry or sampled the household bleach. And a few involve deliberate attempts to kill. John Trestrail directs the center and is an authority on poisons and poisoners.
Well, poisoning homicides differ from normal homicides in that there usually are no witnesses. There are no visible signs of trauma. You see no bullet holes, no stab wounds, no bruises. Usually it's very covert, very secret. The evidence is usually lacking. There's no cartridge cases or anything. Often it's missed, and this crime scene is cleaned up.
Trestrail's office reveals a lifetime of fascination with things poisonous.
Take, for example, spiders. We know that this small spider, compared to one big spider here, you say, well, which one's more poisonous? Well, most little kids will say, obviously, the big one. Well, the tarantula is no more worse than being stung by a bee, but the black widow is capable of killing. So size is not always associated with degree of deadliness.
In Trestrail's view, mankind's knowledge of poisons is extremely ancient. In all likelihood, it goes back to making the connection between eating something and getting sick.
Okay, here we have an example of what primitive man might have first associated cause and effect relationships with. Here is a mushroom called the fly agaric, common name, Amanita muscaria. And it contains chemicals that produce hallucinations and a lot of other bad garbage that go with it. But I'm sure at one time in prehistory, man looked at someone eating this and said, what he did when he ate this was it caused these symptoms. And from that they said, this mushroom contains these poisons. I have this knowledge. This knowledge led to mystery and the shadowy figures of the shamans and witch doctors and everything. So the whole history of toxicology began a couple of 100,000 years ago. It was probably the third weapon developed after the stick and the stone, the poison.
The essence of poisoning is stealth. To shoot or strangle a person, the murderer must be present. Poison offers the opportunity of long-distance homicide. There is also the chance that homicide won't be recorded at all, that the death will be deemed due to natural causes. This is what had occurred at Petersburg General Hospital, until Josephine Thomas's death began to arouse suspicions.
The First Lady came in and was autopsied and was found to have serious heart disease, but she also had lethal concentrations of lidocaine in her blood and in her tissues, which she should not have had because she had no order for it in her chart, nor had she been given lidocaine during her code.
Concerned about the rising death rate, the hospital reviewed all the fatalities since Leroy Hargrave had been assigned to the unit.
And they identified 10 persons that they thought might be at risk for lidocaine poisoning.
James Dalton, now a judge, was assistant Commonwealth's attorney in Petersburg when the deaths took place.
I received a call from an attorney. He said, we've got something I hope doesn't exist, but I'm afraid that there's a possibility that there have been a number of people actually killed at the hospital.
Dalton also learned the name of the chief suspect, Leroy Hargrave.
They were on his shift, and his shift may have varied, but he he moved around, so whenever he was on a shift. But it was a night shift normally that these occurred, and I guess it was not too suspicious initially because I think there is some history of people dying at night more frequently.
So far, the evidence was circumstantial. Hargrave happened to be around when the deaths took place. To convince Dalton, and ultimately a jury, that they were premeditated murders, the medical examiner had to show that the patients had been given lidocaine in unusual amounts. The task was made more difficult because several of the victims had been dead for several months.
It was a toxicological masterpiece as far as detective work because they were, in one case, they're working with fresh tissue. In other instances, they had to recover the poison from bodies which had been embalmed and buried. And in the third instance, they had to try and establish sufficient tissue levels in the biopsy samples from the previous autopsies. When it was all over, of those 10 deaths that were suspicious, 6 were established as due to acute lidocaine poisoning.
Prosecutors pieced together a likely scenario leading to Josephine Thomas's death. It begins with Hargrave stealing some lidocaine. Once the cardiac care unit has settled for the night, he slips into Thomas's room unobserved. After loading a hypodermic with a massive dose of lidocaine, he temporarily disables Thomas's cardiac monitor alarm. Within seconds of administering the drug, it will disrupt the rhythm of Thomas's heart, causing a fatal seizure. Then, Hargrave raises the alarm to divert suspicion from himself.
We need some help in here!
Leroy Hargrave was convicted of poisoning Josephine Thomas and sentenced to life imprisonment. He never confessed, and his motive for killing Thomas and the other patients was never established. Dr. Fierro talks about one theory.
The code, the actual code procedure, the cardiac arrest procedure with the response by a resuscitation team is a very dramatic event. It's very intense, it's very rapid. There are orders, there's no pleases, there's no thank yous, there's just instructions. And this is quite exciting to persons who are on the outside, you know, if you're not related to the person who's being coded. So it was thought that he really got into the code.
Without the initial suspicions of the nurses, without the technology to precisely identify lidocaine weeks or months after death, Leroy Hargrave might have gone free. John Trestrail.
How many bodies do you dig up to find a bullet hole? None. They catch that before they're buried. How many bodies do you dig up to find a poison? Most of them. We're missing them at the point of death, and we're burying the evidence. That's difficult to overcome, but that's what we're going to do.
Among the most difficult poisonings to detect are those involving product tampering. In 1982, 7 people in Chicago died from poison-laced Tylenol. A rash of copycat crimes followed, each with its own bizarre twist. June 11, 1986, the town of Auburn, Washington.
Hey, Mom?
15-year-old Haley Snow finds her mother collapsed in the bathroom. Susan Snow is unconscious. Her pulse is weak. Her breaths come in long, irregular gasps. Haley dials 911. Within 4 hours, this apparently healthy 40-year-old mother of 2 will be declared dead. When paramedics arrive at Seattle's Harborview Medical Center, Susan Snow is comatose. Harborview is the best trauma center in the Northwest, but Snow is fading fast. Snow's condition puzzles the emergency team. Her brain appears swollen, inflamed. She is struggling for breath, and her vital signs are failing. She never recovers consciousness. An hour after admission, she is declared brain dead. What appeared at first as a random death soon will be revealed as murder. It will cost a pharmaceutical company tens of millions of dollars, incite public panic, and set off one of the largest law enforcement operations ever mounted in Washington state. Special Agents Jack Cusack and Mike Byrne were part of the FBI investigation team.
The first victim in this case was Sue Snow. She was a 40-year-old bank teller that lived in Auburn, Washington. And in her daily routine, she always ingested Excedrin.
The cause of Susan Snow's death emerged almost by chance. At her autopsy, the assistant medical examiner noticed the smell of bitter almonds, a telltale sign of cyanide poisoning. Many people cannot detect the odor. By a quirk of genetics, the assistant medical examiner could. Dying by cyanide isn't pleasant. Inside each cell, cyanide displaces oxygen in the energy transport mechanism. Deprived of oxygen, cells collapse. The body dies, slowly asphyxiating, bit by bit. By June 16th, the cyanide source had been identified, the bottle of extra-strength Excedrin capsules in Susan Snow's kitchen. 750,000 bottles of Excedrin were immediately recalled or withdrawn. The news made headlines all over America. Fresh in everyone's minds were the Tylenol poisonings in Chicago. How many would die this time? To catch a poisoner, it helps to get inside his or her head. John Trestrail explains how poisoners target their victims.
One is type S, S meaning specific victim. That victim has a name. They know exactly who it's going to be, whether it's their spouse or whether it's a political figure or somebody. They're going out after an individual with a name. The other type is type R, random victim. In other words, they know they're going to get somebody, they have no idea who it's going to be. And this is where you find your tamperers who are at work, either for ego or for industrial blackmail. And sometimes you can actually find individuals cloaked and camouflaged as random poisoners that are specific. So this gets to be a real mind game, the investigation of this kind of an offender.
Susan Snow's death, it would turn out, was a random killing. She was poisoned in a cold-blooded attempt to draw attention away from the real target. On June 5th, 6 days before Susan Snow died, Bruce Nichol had suddenly collapsed at his mobile home in Kent, Washington. When paramedics arrived, they found the 52-year-old Nichol on his back, gasping for breath. His face was cherry red, his body deathly pale. The paramedics had never seen such symptoms before. Nichol's wife, Stella, told them he had been complaining of headaches. Shortly before collapsing, he had taken 2 extra-strength Excedrin capsules. Stella emphasized Excedrin over and over, the paramedics would remember later. She even retrieved the bottle from her kitchen. Evacuated to Harborview Medical Center in Seattle, Nichol died a few hours later. The autopsy recorded death from natural causes. Nichol had died from emphysema.
Strangely enough, Stella Nichol was also making a few additional calls on her own. She called her doctor, "Are you sure this is what he died of?" She called the paramedics. It could have been anything else. Are you sure that he died of natural causes? She wasn't quite that obvious, but she did make these telephone calls.
Stella called again after news of Susan Snow's poisoning appeared. The lot number of Snow's Excedrin matched the capsules Bruce had taken. Tests quickly proved that Nichol's capsules were laced with cyanide. Nichol's body had been buried, but a vial of his blood remained. It too was tested. Again, cyanide. Across the state, shelves were cleared of Excedrin. But of the thousands of bottles screened, only 5 were found to contain cyanide.
A little quirky thing about that was Stella had 2 of the bottles. And even more strange than that was, she said, hey, I bought one of the bottles about a month before Bruce died. And I bought the second bottle a little more than a week before he died. The odds of that are unbelievable.
Stella's deadly plan began to unfold. First, she poisoned Bruce with cyanide-laced capsules. Then, to make his death appear a random killing, she placed more contaminated capsules on drugstore shelves. Investigators began searching for a motive. They soon found one: insurance fraud.
When Bruce Nichols died, and he was found to have died of natural causes, Stella stood to gain approximately $31,000. If he died accidental death, then this jumped up to about $178,000, and in addition to that, she had a couple $20,000 policies.
To insurance companies, dying by poison counts as accidental death. But had Bruce taken out the policies? Handwriting experts scrutinized his signatures, comparing them to Stella's. The height and width of a letter, its shape and slope, all contain telltale clues. So does the fluidity, the flow and rhythm of the writing, which is very hard to fake. Bruce had not signed the documents. Stella had. Could the investigators now tie Stella to the cyanide? When the capsules were shipped to the FBI's toxicology laboratory in Washington, D.C., an unexpected clue appeared. The white powder was contaminated with tiny green specks. The specks were 99% sodium chloride, ordinary table salt. Bulking out products with salt is a common manufacturing practice. But what of the remaining 1%? Laboratory analysis revealed 4 separate chemicals. 2 were used almost exclusively in preparations called algicides. One commercial product contained all 4 of the chemicals. It came in the form of tablets, which were bright green.
The laboratory called us back and said, we have positively identified those green crystals as a product known as algae destroyer. It's an algicide used in fish tanks by fish fanciers. And that really rang a bell for us because from the first time any of our agents went in Stella's residence, it was obvious she was a fish fancier. She had fish aquariums all around the front room.
The cyanide had led to algae destroyer. Would algae destroyer now lead to Stella? Agents combed pet stores all over Seattle. Someone might remember Stella and the kind of algicide she preferred. The search ended at a store not far from where Stella lived. It stocked algae destroyer, and the manager recognized a photograph of the woman who frequently bought it there. It was Stella Nichol. For months after Bruce Nichols' murder, Stella avoided taking a polygraph test. Her health would not permit it, she explained. In November 1986, she finally agreed to cooperate. The test is designed to pick up tiny physiological changes. Blood pressure and pulse rate are carefully monitored. Each may change when an individual lies. Forensic detectives use the polygraph to eliminate innocent individuals from their suspect list. That was not to be Stella's fate.
I remember the comment she made when we were walking back to the examination room. And she kind of turned around and said, I feel as though I'm walking into a lion's den. I didn't understand the significance of that comment, but I thought, a little unusual. Stella took the examination. I formulated the questions. They were clear-cut. Did you cause your husband's death? Did you put potassium cyanide in those extra strength Excedrin capsules? Stella clearly showed deception on the test. When we informed her of that in straightforward fashion, she asked for her attorney, who was in the waiting room, and basically, everybody knows how the Miranda rights go. That pretty much terminated that interview that day.
More trouble was in store for Stella. This time it came from an unexpected source, her daughter Cindy. When she heard Stella had failed the polygraph, she contacted Jack Cusack.
You know, there's no doubt about it. We had a lot of good breaks come our way on this case. And one that paid off initially was the fact that Stella's daughter, Cindy, decided to share with us some of the conversations that she had had with her mother out at the airport.
In 1985, after years of feuding, Stella and Cindy briefly reconciled. They even got jobs together as security guards at Seattle's SeaTac Airport. It was there, in the pauses between flights, that Cindy heard hints of Stella's plan. First, Stella asked her daughter where she might buy heroin. What was a lethal dose? How much cocaine? Then she talked about hiring a hitman to shoot Bruce while she was out of town, or, less plausibly, to kill him in an automobile crash. Finally, she talked about poisoning Bruce.
You know, Cindy told us that, my mother spent a lot of time doing research at the library. She said, my mother would go to the libraries within the Seattle area, within King County, and research various plants.
At first, Stella hoped to identify poisonous plants on her property, which she could surreptitiously feed to Bruce. To check out Cindy's story, the FBI sent teams of agents to every library in South Kent County. It was a monumental task. They were searching for a book, any book, that would tie Stella to poison. Boxes of books were sent back to the FBI laboratory in Washington, D.C. There, a team of examiners scrutinized them for Stella's fingerprints.
We're kind of part of the human behavior aspect of the case, and that's, in a lot of ways, that's pretty interesting. You're in on the interviews, you're kind of putting the pieces of the puzzle together. A lot of the unsung heroes in this is the poor guy back in the FBI laboratory that gets half a truckload of books and a set of fingerprints and said, find him in there, and he spends months and months, and all of a sudden calls us up one day and says, hey, in this one book, of the multitude of books you sent me, I found 104 of Stella's fingertips in there, and I found 3 palm prints. Well, you can imagine when we're on the receiving end of a telephone call like that.
The circle was closing on Stella. Special Agent Mike Byrne.
So now we have library books that we went out, came up with her latent prints on library books where she actually researched cyanide. We had the insurance where she forged Bruce's signature, and now we had the algae destroy product that she actually purchased.
On May 9th, 1988, Stella Nickell was found guilty of murdering Bruce Nickell and Susan Snow. She was sentenced to life imprisonment without parole.
She never buckled. When Jack had a chance to interview her, said you failed the polygraph examination, it was just a stone face. And she never buckled. Even to this day, she's never said anything.
No one saw Stella poison Bruce. She never even met Susan Snow. Still, she refuses to face her guilt. Denial may be a characteristic of poisoners. According to John Trestrail, imagination is another.
We also find that poisoners are very intelligent, certainly more so than the typical brute-like clubbing of an individual as a sophistication of the weapon's delivery. We find they're very artistic. By artistic, I don't mean they paint pretty pictures, but I mean that they can design almost something like a play.
Investigators believe Joe Mealing adopted Stella Nickell's scenario when he read about her story in Reader's Digest. The case begins on February 2nd, 1991, in Tumwater, Washington, 50 miles southwest of Stella Nichols' home. One evening, as the Mealings are preparing for bed, Joe reminds his wife Jennifer to take a Sudafed. Jennifer's snoring disturbs him, he claims. She must be congested. Jennifer does not feel congested, but under Joe's continued pressure, she agrees. A week earlier, Joe had purchased some Sudafed capsules. But why Sudafed, which they have never used, and why capsules? After Stella Nichols, Jennifer is wary of using them. Moments later, Jennifer collapses and rapidly becomes unconscious. Special Agent Tom Turgeson was involved with the FBI investigation.
What happens when someone is poisoned by sodium cyanide was perhaps best described by Joe Mealing himself when he called the 911 operator and described to the operator what was happening to his wife.
My wife is going into some kind of convulsion.
Second Avenue South.
Yes, 1111, 2nd Avenue South, number 2.
Has she ever had a seizure
No, she's never had a problem before.
How old is she?
She's 29, 28. She called me from the other room, and her mouth is foaming.
Take a deep breath. You need to be calm for your wife, okay?
Yes, I'm calm.
Okay. Does she use drugs or on any medication of any kind?
She just took a Sudafed.
It was fast, it was swift, and she was in agony.
Rushed to the emergency room, Jennifer is in a coma. The staff struggles to save her life, treating Jennifer for diabetic ketoacidosis, elevated acid and blood sugar levels. In the midst of it all, Joe Mealing makes a curious suggestion to the physician in charge. Have you considered poison, cyanide in particular? Miraculously, Jennifer recovers. She tells the emergency room doctor that she had taken Sudafed at her husband's insistence. The doctor alerts the police and orders a cyanide test. Next day, his suspicions are confirmed. There is cyanide in Jennifer's blood. Without Joe Mealing's comments about cyanide, Jennifer Mealing's poisoning might have been overlooked, just as Bruce Nichols' poisoning initially was missed. But why don't toxicology laboratories routinely screen for cyanide? Washington State toxicologist Dr. Barry Logan.
It's relatively uncommon to uncover an unsuspected poisoning. Usually if an investigation has been done properly by the investigator's office, by the coroner's office, we have information up front about what the circumstances are surrounding the death, so we know whether it's likely to be a poisoning or not.
Dozens of compounds show up on routine drug screening tests. Cyanide does not. And there is a further complication.
Prior tests for cyanide have taken a long time to do, and it's been difficult to generate the results in a way in which the information can be used effectively by the investigators.
Before 1991, detecting cyanide involved a multi-step test which took at least a day to complete. Every sample of tissue or blood had to be tested separately. Dr. Logan has devised a simpler procedure, a litmus test. Chemicals are added to a sample generating hydrogen cyanide gas, if cyanide is present. At the same time, the litmus strip, paper impregnated with a complex of chemicals, is added to the tube. If hydrogen cyanide has been produced, the strip turns purple. The degree of coloration is a rough guide to how much cyanide the sample contains.
The test that we currently use in this lab to screen for the presence of cyanide is very easy to do. We can do a large number of screens in a short period of time, which is a big advantage.
Within days of Jennifer Mealing's near poisoning, Dr. Logan had the opportunity to try out his new tests. On February 11th and February 18th, there were two mysterious deaths. Both fell within Logan's jurisdiction.
We conducted a full drug screen on the sample and found the presence of therapeutic levels of a compound called pseudoephedrine, which is the major component of Sudafed. That in itself wasn't particularly remarkable, but at the pathologist's request, we also did a test for cyanide. The cyanide test came back strongly positive, a level that indicated almost certainly the cause of death as being cyanide poisoning.
On March 1st, a pattern finally emerged. 3 cyanide poisonings, 2 deaths. All 3 victims had taken Sudafed. Next day, Sudafed was withdrawn, and the FBI was called in.
Before we've actually focused on Joe, because that's one of the things we look at are the victim families. But Joe made several comments that he is the primary suspect and that he's too smart to ever be caught, and he certainly wouldn't be caught by the FBI.
But Joe Mealing underestimated the agent's tenacity and the FBI's resources. FBI agents carefully examined the backing of the Sudafed packages in the hopes of finding some evidence of tampering. They found that on untampered packages, the foil breaks when the pill is pushed through the back, leaving a jagged edge. But on the tampered packages, the break in the foil was smooth. Mealing had removed the capsules with a razor, carefully slicing them from the package so he could replace them later.
Throughout the investigation, we tried to learn about nearly every aspect of Joe Mealing's life. We tried to reconstruct everything that he did for a fairly extensive time period, geographically place him into the areas of the crime scenes, to find out what's making him tick, try to find the motive, how does he operate. We want to know everything about Joe Mealing.
Joe and Jennifer married in 1986. From the beginning, they had quarreled, mostly about money. Jennifer took multiple jobs to make ends meet. Joe indulged his hobbies: photography, computer, and theatrical makeup. But in the days before her poisoning, Jennifer later admitted, Joe's normal behavior had changed. 5 days before her collapse, Joe bought the Sudafed capsules, which neither of them had used before. When Jennifer returned home, she found Joe polishing his gram scale. Why now? He had not used it in 18 months. Stranger still, Joe was wearing latex gloves. He never cleaned the kitchen. It wasn't his job. Finally, there was the matter of the insurance policy. Joe caught Jennifer on the way to work one day and asked her to sign what she thought was a small life insurance policy for only $30,000.
He knew exactly what he was doing. He asked her to sign it. When she was in a hurry, on the way out the door, she signs, and now he has a total of $700,000 on her life.
Catching poisoners is rarely quick or easy. Despite the forensic detective's arsenal of sophisticated scientific techniques, often the most important element of a successful investigation is sheer doggedness. The FBI Evidence Response Team begins by meticulously examining a crime scene. Agents don special clothing, not to protect themselves, but to safeguard the evidence. With today's ultra-sensitive techniques, a single drop of blood or saliva, a strand of hair or scraping of skin may seal the conviction of a criminal. Careful record keeping is vital. Where each item was found, when and by whom must be documented if the evidence is to stand up in court. FBI headquarters in Washington receives so many items of evidence for testing each day, it has been given its own zip code. Fingerprints still remain among the most important clues. The FBI has more than 200 million on file. There are dozens of ways to develop otherwise invisible prints, latent prints. One of the most effective is with the vapor of superglue, which adheres to the print and raises it to the surface. In the Sudafed poisoning case, Agent Turgeson and his colleagues fingerprinted every piece of evidence that might implicate Joe Mealing. 6 contaminated bottles were eventually retrieved, but Joe's fingerprints could not be found. Dozens of library books were examined, again without success. Perhaps Joe remembered that fingerprints helped catch Stella Nickel, and so he wore rubber gloves. FBI agents mapped the locations where the tampered packs were found. Joe told the FBI he bought Sudafed from a store near his house. Other tampered packages turned up in a store in the Lacey area near Joe's work. But 4 stores in Tacoma also had tampered product. Special Agent Tom Turgeson.
The red dots indicate places where we could place Joe Mealing through physical evidence, through receipts, through witnesses, and other methods. Place him in one store, for instance, and in other areas around the time frame of the tamperings and in the immediate surroundings of those stores.
Joe's link to the 2 stores near his home and work were evident enough. But what of the 4 stores in Tacoma?
We found out that Joe would frequent the stripper bars and talk to the strippers and seemingly just relate his problems to them. We found several of the dancers from topless dance clubs who recognized Joe Mealing, who testified against him at the trial, who placed him up here at certain dates and times. Some of them said he was a regular frequenter of the establishments, and they easily recognized him.
The investigators had tied Joe to the tampered Sudafed packages. Could they now tie him to the cyanide? As the major suspect, the FBI tapped Joe's telephone early on in the investigation. One day, they heard him describe in vivid detail a building he had once visited. From the description, FBI agents identified it as the Emerald City Chemical Company in Kent, Washington. Among other things, Emerald City Chemicals sells cyanide. When investigators examined the poison register for the day Joe had visited the area, they could not find his signature. A Richard P. Johnson had bought cyanide that day. It was all the FBI required. As in the Stella Nickel case, handwriting analysis proved decisive. Despite Joe Mealing's attempt to disguise his handwriting, there are clear similarities between Richard P. Johnson's signature and Joe's own. Consider the formation of the J, for example, the shape of the O, and the way the letters sit upon the line. The person who signed the poison register was Joe.
It was determined that Joe Mealing purchased 1 pound of sodium cyanide on January 11. A pound similar to this container, which is a representative container of sodium cyanide in the amount of 1 pound. That's a lot of poison, considering a pill the size of a Sudafed capsule killed 2 people and injured 1 other.
One last point puzzled the investigators. When the clerk at the chemical store was shown a photograph of Joe Mealing, he failed to recognize him.
In the residence of Joe Mealing, we found this array of theatrical makeup equipment. Experts in theatrical makeup testified at his trial and determined on the witness stand that there is the equipment here available to make someone up to be unrecognizable as to their true identity. We found a photograph of a person who looks elderly, graying hair, wrinkled face, and it's a friend of Joe Mealing in his late 20s, early 30s.
It had taken 18 months of exhaustive investigation, but by August 1992, the FBI case against Joe Mealing was complete. Shortly before Jennifer's poisoning, he prepared 6 packages of Sudafed. In each, he replaced the Sudafed with capsules filled with lethal doses of cyanide. 5 packets he returned to drugstore shelves. one remained at home, to kill Jennifer. Joe Mealing was indicted on 2 counts of murder and the attempted murder of Jennifer Mealing. He is now serving life imprisonment. Among evidence discovered at Joe's home, agents found one last item of note, an outline for a screenplay about the poisoning of Jennifer. The protagonist, James Martin, is described as devoted, honest, reliable, sincere, truthful.
Joe Mealing was greedy. He was very selfish. I don't think he was concerned about the health and welfare of his wife, Jennifer. He's concerned about Joe.
Just as Stella Nichol learned from the Tylenol poisonings and Joe Mealing learned from Stella Nichol's mistakes, so too investigators learn to prevent and detect such murders. Dr. Barry Logan.
There's no way to prevent a product from being tampered with. What we can do is package it in such a way that if anything is done to interfere with the material, that it's evident to the person when they buy it from the supermarket or before they use the product.
What's important for the conviction of a poisoner are 4 things I call the conviction pyramid. Number 1, we have to have the victim. Number 2, we have to have the poisoner. And then we have to have the poison and the intent. And all these things have to be linked together. Poison to victim, poison to offender, offender to victim, and then finally the intent. Was the intent really to kill that victim? Once you get those 4 things locked on, then you have the potential for a conviction.
Each year, forensic science provides investigators with powerful new tools. How many poisoners still elude detection? We don't know. Perhaps more than we would like to admit. Who is winning the battle? In the end, no one. The fight goes on.
In a church parking lot, a woman is found murdered. The killer leaves few clues and no weapon. A routine suicide investigation takes a macabre twist. Can a camera prove this was murder? And a fire rages in a nursing home, killing 15 residents. Armed only with his photographs, it will take the coroner 6 years to prove this tragedy was no accident. Forensic photographers solved these crimes by preserving crucial details missed by the naked eye. After the evidence is erased, the new detectives must rely on camera clues. In Fairfax County, Virginia, in March 1989, a man called police to report a woman had fallen in an icy church parking lot. An officer reported back from the scene. The woman didn't slip and fall. She was murdered. At police headquarters, forensic photographer Jeff Miller knew he had a long night ahead of him. He packed his equipment and got ready to meet investigators gathering at the scene. Where some officers shoot criminals, Miller shoots film. In his 18 years with the Fairfax Police, he has witnessed countless crime scenes through his lens. If he is the eyes of law enforcement, then his photos are its long-term memory.
Ed, this is the ID we got off of the victim.
Investigators arrived at the parking lot and planned their strategy. Detective Ed Guckenberger headed the investigation. As his team uncovered clues, they depended on Miller. It's in Miller's camera that all the clues come together to solve a case and hopefully to catch a killer.
We want to be able to document the scene, in essence, take the scene from here to the courthouse just exactly the same way that we find it.
Miller began by mapping the crime scene. The initial clues were both simple and brutal. The victim was lying face up in a pool of her own blood. She had been shot several times, with the fatal bullet to her head. Nearby, her purse was found untouched. Robbery was not the motive. Miller first documented the wide view of the crime scene, which was blanketed in darkness. To bring it into focus, Miller used a technique called painting with light. The camera was mounted on a tripod. Its shutter kept open as an assistant covered the lens. The same frame of film was exposed repeatedly as Miller passed along the edges of the scene, firing his flash as many as 24 times for a single picture. Each flash illuminates a slightly different area. This photograph is the result of Miller's work. The bright lights look like street lamps, but they were made by Miller's flash. Though he was holding the flash as it fired, Miller doesn't appear because he was behind the light. He remained invisible as he exposed the evidence. After Miller took his wide shot by painting with light, he moved in to photograph every detail of the scene. He worked his way closer and closer to the victim, documenting her wounds and the position of her body.
You guys see these bloody tire tracks?
Miller discovered some bloody tire tracks near the victim.
It looks like when a vehicle left here, it ran through the pool of
Officers were sent to follow the trail, while others stayed behind to comb for additional clues. Miller found 2 bullet casings. The man who called the police parked his van over them. Miller photographed the evidence where it lay. Moving the van again would only have disturbed more of the crime scene.
Hey guys.
As Miller hunted for additional evidence, officers returned from their search of the neighborhood. They found an abandoned car a block away. They ran the tags. It was registered to the victim's address. The site of the car became a second crime scene. Again, Miller photographed the scene from every angle, hoping to uncover any clues that might explain how the woman ended up so far from her vehicle. As he did at the church parking lot, Miller first photographed the site at a distance, then moved in for close-ups. The driver's side window was shattered. Pellets of glass were strewn about the car's interior. A spent cartridge lay in the snow outside the driver's side door, and a bullet was lodged in the plastic molding. On the passenger's side, Miller found even more. Pressed into the thin snow were footprints, too big to be the victim's. Forensic technicians have a tough time making casts of snowy tracks, and Miller knew the prints would melt with the rising sun. So it was up to him and his camera to preserve the evidence before it faded away.
You can cut it out if it's in ice and try to keep it at a certain temperature and everything else. Well, I guess sometimes it works, sometimes it doesn't. There are different chemicals that you could possibly spray on it to try and keep it. When all in all is said and done, the photograph is the only evidence that was able to totally keep
that impression intact.
The search of the neighborhood uncovered more potential evidence. A patrolman found a second car abandoned a half-mile from the church parking lot after apparently skidding off the road. The second car became the third crime scene during this night of sporadic clues. Police began to search for a connection. On the seat, an officer found a leather gun holster. He ran the tags on the vehicle. The owner lived just 2 doors from the victim.
Process this scene.
At dawn, Jeff Miller inspected the church parking lot again. He hoped the sun would shed new light on the case. By now, the snow had melted.
We wanted to come back and check the asphalt parking lot and make sure that we collected all the evidence. We don't want to leave anything behind. Once we leave here, you can't come back.
His effort paid off. Daylight revealed fragments of glass buried in the snow the night before. If the glass matched the broken window in the victim's car, police could say the car was in the parking lot when she was killed.
Okay, there's something over here.
The melting snow also revealed a bullet at the edge of the lot.
So tell you what, let me get a couple pictures of it first.
Tests would determine if it matched the bullet found in the victim's car. While Miller checked the parking lot, Ed Guckenberger hit the road. His first stop, the victim's house. In homicide cases, family members are usually the first suspects.
I have to read very quickly once I knock on that door the type of response that I get from that person who opens it. And in this case, I had a husband that was dressed in a bathroom that I had woken up out of his sleep. He stated that his wife should have been home and she was at a church meeting. As a homicide investigator, what you then have to do is you have to read that person. Does he seem sincere? Is this some ploy or something else? Well, there was nothing from what he was telling me to show that he was in any way involved in this.
Confident the husband wasn't involved with the woman's murder, officers followed their next lead. They didn't have far to go. The owner of the second car was the victim's neighbor. He was also no stranger to police. The churchyard murder investigation was less than 10 hours old. So far, Detective Guckenberger had no suspects. His only lead was the owner of the second car. The man police wanted to talk with was Gary Asa Donahue. Ed Guckenberger asked him to come to the station for questioning. To his buddies in his motorcycle gang, Donahue was known as Redneck. Police knew him by his criminal record. Donahue told police he'd been out drinking the night before. When he got home, he realized his dog was loose, so he drove around to look for him. He lost control of his car on the icy road and skidded into a ditch. Unable to get free, Donahue said he walked home. Although his route would have taken him past the victim's car, Donahue told police he didn't see it. He said the holster in his own car belonged to a friend, but he didn't have the gun. Police were suspicious. They asked Donahue for his jacket and boots, which might hold clues that told a different story. Donahue willingly surrendered them. In the darkroom, Miller developed one of his most hopeful leads. Up until now, he'd been merely documenting the various crime scenes. Now, he put his darkroom skills to the test to flush out latent clues. Using the ruler he placed by the icy footprints when he snapped the photo, Miller created a life-size portrait of the prints. A boot print can be almost as telling as a fingerprint, if it's clear enough. Miller was happy with the photo. Armed with this image, it became just a matter of matching the prints to the boots that made them. Miller sent his photographs to a forensic lab for a detailed comparison with Donahue's boots. Lab technicians first examined the size of the boots. If the prints are off, even by a few millimeters, there is no match. The tread pattern was examined next. Technicians pored over the sole of the boot, making sure that every detail matched Miller's photograph. So far, so good. But next came the litmus test, matching the boot to the foot that wore it. It required a close look at the boot's anatomical wear.
Anatomical wear is the wear that each of us impart into the bottom of the shoe based on how tall we are, how much we weigh, our bone makeup, how we walk, whether we walk on the inside of our feet, the outside of our feet, more so on the heel, more so on the toe.
Donahue wore a lift in one of his boots. It added to the unique anatomical wear and left its signature in the boot prints. Last, technicians examined the boots and the photographs for accidental wear and tear, nicks and cuts from daily use.
In this particular case, there are certain marks, certain cuts, certain indentations in the tread pattern that the examiner was able to see in the photograph and was able to find also in the shoe, that he's able to say that this shoe made this impression to the exclusion of all the other shoes in the whole wide world.
The footprint evidence placed Donahue at the victim's car. Guckenberger credits the photographs with keeping the investigation on track.
If we didn't have the photographs of that shoe impression, then we're mainly just stuck with firearms evidence. A person might have a gun, but who actually shoots that gun? But this person wears his own boots.
Investigators then examined Donahue's jacket, combing it meticulously for fibers, hair, cloth, anything that might link Donahue to the victim. They found glass particles. What new information could they provide? Forensic tests determined the glass from the victim's car matched the glass in the parking lot. If the glass from Donahue's jacket matched these samples, it would place Donahue at the site where the car window was shattered and where the victim was killed. The glass matched. Police could now prove that Donahue was in the parking lot and maybe in the car at the time of the murder. The bloody tire tracks were the next link. Because the victim couldn't have driven through her own blood, investigators were able to show she was killed in the parking lot and that somebody else moved her car.
As her car was leaving the scene, it drove through a pool of blood that was coming from her. The blood adhered to the tire, and the rotation of the tire through the parking lot kept leaving a blood transfer onto the ground. And so that's what that was from.
The scattered clues were coming together, thanks in large part to Miller's accurate documentation of the scene. The only thing missing was the murder weapon. To help pinpoint it, investigators tested the bullets and casings found near the victim and her car. Another casing was found in Donahue's car. Lab tests showed all the casings were fired from a rare Hungarian pistol, a 9mm auto-loading Fromer, a gun that peaked in popularity around World War II. Tests of the impression on the holster from Donahue's car matched the impression a Fromer would make. But the gun was nowhere to be found. Police scoured the area and came up empty. Donahue, for all his earlier cooperation, drew the line at providing the gun, swearing he never had it.
And he probably thought that whatever he did with this gun, and I don't know, we never did find that gun, probably thought that he was past all this. That if we didn't have a gun, we probably could not prove that he was the one that actually fired the shot or did anything else.
But if there ever was a smoking gun in this case, it was Miller's photographs of the boot prints, something Donahue didn't count on. Officer Miller and Detective Guckenberger began to build their case. With the glass fragments, the shell casings, the bullets, and the ever-important boot prints, they were confident they could prove beyond a reasonable doubt that Gary Asa Donahue was a killer.
Okay, great.
Miller's photographs became primary evidence before a grand jury, which sent back Donahue's indictment. The photographic clues that Miller provided helped piece together the story of that ill-fated night.
Okay, what I believe happened is that Mr. Donahue's driving down the street. He turns down the wrong street to go to his house, probably because he's drunk.
Donahue lost control of his car and slid off the road. Angry, he got out of the car and began to walk home. As the victim came down the street, she recognized the car. She likely had seen it in her neighborhood for years. Donahue bought it from another neighbor.
Perhaps she's acting as a good Samaritan. She stops to offer him a ride, or perhaps he stepped out on the road and flagged her down. The other possibility is he stepped out on the road with a gun and made her stop for him. They go down the street to the church parking lot. Something occurs inside the car in the church. I don't know what that is. In homicide investigation, you're not always going to be able to answer every single question that you have. She falls down to the ground, lays down on her back, face up. Donahue then has a better target, a non-moving target. He then advances towards her, and as she's lying there on the ground, he puts the gun right up to her face almost and executes her. He then leaves the scene, drives down to the end of the street, where again, for whatever reason, he runs off the road, probably due to his intoxication, runs off the road, wrecks it into the trees. For whatever reason, he decides to clear his weapon. He works the action, the one cartridge casing that's still in the gun, ejects out the broken driver's window, and is found on the ground next to the vehicle.
For whatever reason, he slid across the seat and left by the passenger's side, leaving his boot prints in the snow.
This is your worst type of killer, because this is the person that kills out of meanness. There was no reason at all to kill this woman. She was not, your victim that puts herself in a situation because of a crime. She's not that type of person. She's the type of person that her innocence is what got her into trouble. That day, she ran across an animal.
Gary Asa Donahue was sentenced to life in prison. The senseless death of the woman in the church parking lot shocked the residents of her quiet community. Further south, in Miami, Florida, murder is more common, but no less shocking. Through these these doors at the Metro-Dade County Morgue in Florida come every kind of death, both natural and unnatural. As bodies come into the morgue, it's the job of forensic photographers to document wounds and other identifying traits before the corpses are stored. The work is never routine and often tragic. On this day, a 5-year-old girl is the victim of a random shooting. She was caught in crossfire during a parade. Forensic technicians examine her wounds. Perhaps they hold the key to the killer. Dade County detectives rely on the information to start their investigation.
We are trying to determine, number one, what caliber of round it was that did strike the victim. And number two, the path of the bullet as it entered the body and then exited. That will help us in trying to determine possibly who our shooter is.
In the medical examiner's office, high-tech photography is as much a tool of the trade as a scalpel. If a death looks suspicious, it's up to forensic photographers to document the details. They start with the wound and then photograph individual organs as the autopsy proceeds. These gruesome photographs survive long after a case is closed. They provide a visual database authorities can refer to if a similar case comes up. Knowing what to look for streamlines any investigation. In 1986, Dade County Police responded to a suicide. Jack Sebastian lay dead, a 12-gauge shotgun by his side. When death is involved, it's standard procedure to capture everything on film.
Did you see anyone enter or leave the house?
The victim's girlfriend told police she was outside when she heard the blast.
I want to get everything.
Sebastian left no note. At the morgue, a staff member felt suspicious about Sebastian's wound and called medical examiner Jay Barnhart.
Good morning, Dr. Alvarez. What do you have?
Barnhart mapped and measured the wound. In his initial opinion, this was no suicide. Sebastian was shot almost directly between the eyes. His wound was surrounded by stippling, small speckled burns made by the gunpowder exploding from the shotgun's muzzle. If Sebastian held the gun directly to his head, the gunpowder wouldn't have marked his face. From the stippling, Barnhart knew the gun must have been held some distance from Sebastian's forehead when he pulled the trigger. Something wasn't right, and Barnhart was determined to get to the bottom of it. First, Barnhart ordered photographs of Sebastian's wounds. Then he took X-rays of Sebastian's head to reveal the internal damage he couldn't see. The X-ray showed the path of the pellets.
This is an X-ray showing the dispersion of the birdshot through the skull. And if we take the point of entrance, which is just above the bridge of the nose, and connect that by an imaginary line or series of lines to the location of the pellets, we see that the pellets are to the left and below the point of entrance, meaning that the shot then was coming from above and to the right of the entrance.
Barnhart had to find out if Sebastian could hold the gun at the angle indicated by the X-ray. It wouldn't have been easy. Investigators even placed the shotgun in the extended arms of Sebastian's corpse to see if he could fire the gun. His fingers could barely reach the trigger. Considering all possibilities, investigators tried to fire the gun with their feet. they found they could do it with bare toes. But Sebastian wore round-toed boots, making it impossible for him to fire the gun. These extreme tests were necessary. Barnhart knew that in court, he must be prepared to answer even the strangest questions.
They'll ask you things like, well, couldn't he have been laying in bed and have his foot up over his head and pulled it with his... and if he'd not been wearing shoes, you'd probably have to say, yes, he could.
Barnhart wasn't satisfied with his findings. He needed to determine the distance between Sebastian and the gun when it fired. Barnhart and his staff shot a piece of poster board from distances of 1 to 7 feet and examined the damage. From 1 foot away, the force of the shot cracked the board. The impact was enormous. At 2 feet, the impact was less severe as the buckshot began to spread. At 4 feet, the hole roughly doubled in size as the pellets fanned out. At 6 feet from the board, the buckshot dispersed further, leaving clear pellet marks. Barnhart concluded the muzzle of the gun had to be at least 1.5 feet away from Sebastian's head. He was convinced someone else must have pulled the trigger. But Barnhart feared his simple test wasn't enough to sway a jury. He turned to the Forensic Imaging Bureau for help. Todd Reeves runs Dade County's Forensic Imaging Bureau, one of the best in the United States. The Bureau has more than 3,000 square feet of advanced photographic equipment. The well-equipped studios can document huge pieces of evidence while capturing clues invisible to the naked eye. Here, a technician uses a microscope-equipped camera to examine a cast of a jawbone. Her findings will help match a suspect to a bite mark. A potentially useful image may come from a less than perfect source, like a security camera or shot from a moving vehicle. The lab can clean up, enlarge, and enhance photographs. Computers reveal unseen details in evidence photos, bringing clues into focus. A huge computer database of fingerprints can match even the vaguest finger smudge. An editing suite helps investigators assemble persuasive courtroom presentations.
The higher the quality, the better delineation you're giving the jury, the more factual information. And that's what we're providing is fact, not fiction. And that's the true message behind professional forensic photography.
Jay Barnhart knew he had a case for the murder of Jack Sebastian. But he'd rely on Reeves and his high-tech tools to make it bulletproof.
We've got a case of this biker.
Every fatal wound tells a tale. In the case of Jack Sebastian, the injuries around the wound completed the story. When a gun fires, it shoots more than projectiles. From the muzzle comes a flash of fire, a blast of gas, a puff of smoke, and a shower of sparks. Each can leave its mark. Place the muzzle of a gun directly against the target, and all this debris goes into the wound. Pull the muzzle further away, and the debris becomes more and more dispersed. The forensic photographs of Sebastian's injuries showed the stippling wounds. They also revealed bruising under the eyes, on the nose, and on the cheek. Barnhart believed the damage was caused by the open petals of the shot cup, a plastic sleeve that holds the buckshot. But how far away would the shotgun have to be to allow the shot cup petals to open? Barnhart and Reeves believed high-speed photography could provide the definitive answer.
And it allows the doctors and the police that are investigating the case to be able to see things we can't see with the human eye, things that are moving as fast as Mach 15.
High-speed photography can stop a bullet in midair. More than that, it allows investigators to examine, frame by frame, the impact and damage that bullet produces as it connects with its target. Wounds can then be matched with bullets. In cases where no weapon is found or a bullet isn't recovered, a series of high-speed photos may help investigators make the identification. Reeves and Barnhart designed an experiment to determine the distance between Sebastian's head and the muzzle of the gun that killed him.
I don't know if there's any, I think we have film in the 35.
Or crank it in there after it's in the vise.
They mounted a shotgun on a rack, held perfectly level. Next, they positioned two cameras along the line of fire. As the shell and debris left the muzzle, they would fly past the cameras, which would snap their picture. It was crucial that the gun not move when fired. They loaded the gun with the same type of ammunition that killed Sebastian.
Let it go.
Fire in the hole. Okay.
Reeves then placed a sensitive microphone near the muzzle of the gun. When the microphone picks up the sound of the shotgun blast, it trips a flash unit. A ruler placed behind the microphone measures how far the shell travels as the shot cup petals begin to open. The high-speed flash fires for 1/2 millionth of a second, necessary when photographing at blazing speeds. For the clearest image, Reeves and Barnhart need the camera to be as close to the flying shell as possible, but must determine the best place to put it. They first try the test with a large format Polaroid camera. The fast-developing film allows them to take test photos of the experiment so they can position the second camera correctly. For the actual test, they use a standard 35mm camera with highly sensitive film to freeze the shell in its path. The investigators are now ready to try their experiment and catch a shell with a flash of light. If all goes well, they'll produce an irrefutable record of the shell and its components in flight. Barnhart can then use the information to verify where the plastic petals on the shot cup began to open into the pattern that damaged Sebastian's face. Each time the gun is fired, Reeves inches the microphone away from the muzzle. As a result, the flash will go off a little later. The projectile will travel a little farther. The camera will catch it as it opens in flight. Initially, the white-hot plastic shot cup hasn't expanded. After 18 inches, the petals begin to spread, discharging the pellets and falling away. At about 30 inches, the petals have fully opened. Barnhart and Reeves succeed in making a photographic point-by-point map of a shotgun shell's trajectory. By comparing the wound with the pictures, investigators determined the gun was fired from a distance of 18 to 24 inches from Sebastian's face.
Expand our database here.
The results corroborated Barnhart's own experiments and gave him the evidence he needed to prove Sebastian couldn't have possibly shot himself. Police then confronted Sebastian's girlfriend, Diane Shelton, with the evidence. She confessed to pulling the trigger and was sentenced to 12 years in prison. Unlike any other tool, forensic photography can expose evidence that would otherwise have been missed. And sometimes, photographs are the only way to prove a crime was committed at all. When a Pennsylvania coroner was certain a tragic accident camouflaged a mass murder, his photographs became his only allies. Forensic photography played a crucial role in the investigation of a devastating fire in a nursing home. Retired Wayne County, Pennsylvania coroner Robert Jennings spent 6 years trying to prove the fiery deaths were no accident. Jennings has spent much of his life combining his role as coroner and his love of photography. He has been snapping shots for more than 45 years.
We got some fire to the left here. Let's really knock that down before we go in.
His story begins on the grim night of October 19, 1971. A fire killed all 15 residents of the Geiger Nursing Home, a private home attached to a farmhouse near Honesdale, Pennsylvania. Most of the victims were found in their beds, dead from smoke inhalation. A few were overcome as they crawled on the floor. As coroner, Jennings rushed to the scene. State police and firefighters had begun removing bodies before Jennings had a chance to document the area. After asking the firemen to stop, Jennings began photographing all he could. The location of the victims could prove important. Jennings tried to track the blaze with his camera lens inside the pitch-dark building. Time was of the essence. He went right to work, hoping his pictures could help determine what caused the blaze. But the darkness and smoke foiled his efforts. Reluctantly, he went home to await the sunrise. By the time he returned the next morning, the smoke had cleared and the gloom had lifted enough for him to get his shots of the ruins.
If your normal f-stop would be f11, then you would have to open up at least 2 more stops and give it more light to get the detail and so forth that's needed in this type of evidence photography, that at least arson experts have an opportunity to examine the charring and so forth.
Working in the crumbling shell of the building was time-consuming and treacherous. But Jennings was determined to commit every inch of the wreckage to film. He succeeded. Painting with light revealed details of an alligator burn, a charring pattern similar to the rough scales of the reptile. The pattern is created at very high temperatures. By illuminating the area from several angles, Jennings photographed the changes in the burn pattern. Later, he would refer to his photographs to trace the fire's path. Burn patterns on the walls suggested the blaze tore through the hallway. A section of the corridor was almost totally consumed. In one spot, the fire burned a hole in the floor. The destruction at this spot was unlike anywhere else in the building. Jennings focused his attention and his camera on the hole. He crawled under it, photographing its edges. Fires usually burn from the bottom up, igniting whatever's above them. But at this spot, the fire looked to have burned from the top down. To Jennings, that suggested an accelerant was used, some flammable liquid that seeped through the floor, carrying flames with it. Before Jennings completed his investigation, state police announced their findings. They concluded the fire began in the laundry room, caused by a bad thermocoupling in a clothes dryer. Jennings wasn't buying it. He'd spend the next 6 years trying to prove them wrong. Photographs were Jennings' only clues. The ceiling above the dryer where the state police said the fire started showed minimal damage compared to the highly charred hallway. The wires in the laundry room were still intact. Jennings even found unburned clothing inside the dryer. Picture by picture, he continued building his case. Today, a quarter century later, Jennings' evidence remains, though the building is long gone.
Within a few weeks after the fire, the building is totally destroyed and demolished, razed. So therefore, the evidence that I photographed, that's gone. And if you don't have the photographs there to support, to look it over, it's pretty hard to solve a crime.
For Jennings, not much has changed in the art and science of photography since he snapped his first picture. Today, as he did 25 years ago in the Geiger nursing home case, he processes his own photographs by hand, carefully controlling every step of exposure, developing, and printing. He sharpened his skills, both as a photographer and an investigator. He's gained a better sense of what to look for and how to capture it on film. A charred piece of timber, a pile of debris. These seemingly trivial objects can be clues that make or break a case. Jennings has to be sure no detail is overlooked. An investigation is a lot like a roll of exposed film. All the information is there. You just have to know how to make it visible. In his darkroom, Jennings exposes many secrets, and in the process, he sometimes develops even more questions. State police were impressed by Jennings' photographs, but still wouldn't concede the fire was arson. They didn't waver for one simple reason: no suspect. If the fire had been deliberately set, who lit the match? In the end, Jennings' pictures exposed him. Hoping to prove the fire was deliberately set, Jennings turned to Nurse Vaudine Lyon, the sole survivor of the blaze. She told him about one of the home's gentlest patients, Mr. Maurice Flynn. Mr. Flynn, a deeply shy and private man, would end each day in his room, reading the Bible by candlelight. So it was odd that after the fire, Flynn's body was found seated in the room of a married couple. He was the only patient not in his own room when the fire occurred. He was also the only patient found completely naked. Scarcely burned, he died seated in a chair with his arms and legs extended, as though crucified.
He was known as the gentleman of the house. He was there to help people, but he was very private. He wouldn't even leave a nurse or anyone with him when he's taking a shower. He just didn't want any help. And this was always a puzzling part as to why this particular person was found this distance away.
Flynn's own room was some 60 feet from where his body was found. The smoke and flame would have made that simple walk impossible. Jennings determined the blaze started at the intersection of the hallways. In order for Flynn to get to the couple's room during the fire, he would have had to pass right through it. On the other hand, if he wanted to escape the blaze, the exit was near his room, easily within his reach.
And it's impossible that he could have come down that distance and through that T intersection with the type of physical evidence that we found on his body, because he would have never made it, and he would have been completely charred.
Jennings wondered why Flynn was so far from his room while most everyone else died in bed from the fast-spreading blaze. On June 8, 1972, Robert Jennings exhumed the body of Maurice Flynn. Even before the autopsy, Jennings noticed something odd. Flynn's skin was almost cherry red, indicating carbon monoxide poisoning. The autopsy showed Flynn's lung tissue had absorbed gasoline vapors shortly before he died. More clues came out during Lyon's interview. Flynn was the only resident in the home allowed to have matches to light the candles by which he read his Bible. He also mowed the lawn around the nursing home, making him one of the only residents with access to gasoline. Flynn behaved strangely the day before the fire, ranting and citing biblical verse. The home's other residents also acted strangely. They paid off forgotten debts and talked of a journey to a better place.
Everything centered around the strange events of Mr. Flynn, why he was completely naked. One of his comments to one of the nurses on duty that day was that you come in this world naked and you leave it naked. And that stuck in our minds a lot with finding his completely nude body.
It looked like Jennings had his suspect. But state police wouldn't revise their conclusions. Jennings persisted. By early 1975, Jennings was confident that he had enough evidence to prove his case. He exercised his powers as coroner and swore in a jury of 6 men and women. He presented his findings while the state police defended their position during the 2-day legal battle. Afterward, the jury concluded the fire was caused by an illegal act by a person or persons unknown. They ruled that investigators should attempt to discover who caused the 15 deaths. Why Flynn set the fire will never be known. Some have speculated that his actions were the result of a deranged mind. Others have said Flynn and the other nursing home residents had all agreed to die, thinking it better to end their lives than live in the home. In the end, the closest we may ever come to finding out the cause of the fire lies in Jennings' photographs and his efforts at solving this crime. After the coroner jury's verdict, Jennings filled out the death certificates of the residents of the Geiger nursing home. 14 homicides and a suicide.
It was worth the effort. I felt that I had a duty to represent the other 14 people that paid a price their lives in this particular incident, and particularly for the families as well.
Forensic photography is the new detective's secret weapon. Often overlooked, it is crucial in a criminal investigation. Through sophisticated camera equipment, determination, and ingenuity, forensic photographers become the eyes and memories of investigators. They are also the advocates of the victims, helping bring criminals to justice.